की महिमा, तीनों लोकों की रानी, सौंदर्य की देवी, जिनसे जगत है दीवानी। पाशा कुशमाला वेद धरे हैं हाथों में, भक्तों की तुम ही हो जीवन की कहानी। त्रिपुरा सुंदरी, त्रिपुरा सुंदरी, जय तुम्हारी गाए, तेरे चरणों में आकर हम सब सुख पाए। ललिते दिव्य रूप वाली त्रैलोक्य की माँ, सौंदर्य
मुखी तू है स्तंभन की दिव्य शक्ति, तेरे मंत्रों से थम जाता है दुष्ट प्राकाहत। तेरे क्रोध में छुपा है सबको चुप कराने का बल। श्री भागला मुखी तू है शत्रुओं के मुख को बंद करने का कल। भागला मुखी तेरे स्तंभन शक्ति की महिमा पार, दर्शन से दुष्टों के गले पर लग जाता है ताले का हार। तेरे मंत्रों में है गहरी शक्ति और विजय का संकेत। श्री भागला मुखी तू है शत्रुओं की चुप्पी की अनमोल रेत। सत्य और धर्म की रक्षा में तू है सबसे बड़ी दीवार। तेरे संबंध से मिटता है हर विपत्ति और तर्क का शिकार। तेरे दर्शन से खुलते हैं सही मार्ग और ज्ञान के द्वार। श्री भागला मुखी तू है साधकों की रक्षा का अद्वितीय आधार। भागला मुखी तेरे स्तंभन शक्ति की महिमा पार, तेरे दर्शन से दुष्टों के गले पर लग जाता है ताले का हार। तेरे मंत्रों में है गहरी शक्ति और विजय का संकेत। श्री भागला मुखी तू है शत्रुओं की चुप्पी की अनमोल रेत। तेरे स्तंभन से थम जाते हैं बुरे विचार और बुरे कर्म। तेरे भक्तों को मिलती है सुख और शांति की अमृत धारा। श्री भागला मुखी तू है हर बाधा और संकट का नाशक शांति स्वर। तेरे मंत्रों से ही साकार होते हैं भक्तों के हर सपना और विचार। भागला मुखी तेरे स्तंभन शक्ति की महिमा पार, तेरे दर्शन से दुष्टों के गले पर लग जाता है
नमस्ते भाई, कैसे हैं?
Can you hear me? Okay. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Is that coming up okay? Anisha, can't hear you.
Anish, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Done. Yeah, looks good, Adrian.
I have an uneasy relationship with technology, even though I'm talking about AIs.
Oh, talk about it, Adrian. Me too.
Yeah, most of us.
It just doesn't like me.
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Does anyone remember where exactly this photograph is from? Anish? Which particular book?
Chaitanya would know, perhaps.
He hasn't come yet, I think. There he is.
Yeah.
डॉक्टर कुंटे, ये तस्वीर कहाँ की है? आपको पता है?
Mute है, mute. आप म्यूट पे हो.
फिर भी म्यूट पर हो.
हेलो. यस यस.
Yes.
हाँ. तो वसुंधरा आचरेकर जी ने आचरा, ये जो गांव है कोकण में, वहाँ राम मंदिर है, वहाँ रामनवमी का उत्सव होता था, तो उस वक्त का ये फोटोग्राफ है.
अच्छा.
पीछे वसुंधरा आचरेकर जी के पीछे वहाँ सुरेश आचरेकर भी हैं. हारमोनियम पर गोविंदराव पटवर्धन है, उनके पास पीएल देशपांडे और कुमार गंधर्व दिखाई दे रहे हैं. और इस तरफ के दानपुरे पर नारायण पंडित है, वायलिनिस्ट. और
अच्छा.
काफी इंटरेस्टिंग फोटोग्राफ है.
Hi, Andrew.
Hey, hey.
There, I'll say hi again and unmute. Okay. Hi.
Hi, Andrew. How are you? everyone, this is Dr. Andrew Alter. Yeah. And Anjum, we have had a long association with Andrew. He's also teaches in Australia, and we hope to invite him also sometime to deliver a lecture.
By all means, please.
We will see. I'm not sure I'm as august as the other people in the meeting at present, but no.
Are we going for time? Or
No, I think we should give it a bit
we should
of
wait. Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
team of us.
In the meanwhile, hello everyone. Stefan, morning. What time is it in Germany?
7:30.
Oh, okay. I'm glad the memorial lecture wakes people up in more ways than one.
It does.
People are streaming in.
Yes.
Anish, Shubha able to join today?
She's in the other room.
Yes.
I'm not. Do you want me to go and check what?
Fine. Adrian, you want to play something in the meanwhile to set the mood going?
Or Chaitanya can play some of Dr. Ranade's
Composition.
if that's possible. Chaitanya.
Particularly in his own voice, if you have something.
Yeah, exactly.
One of his favorites was Radhike Sarang.
Mm-hmm.
Chaitanya, possible?
जाऊन 5 वर्ष कृष्ण पाहुनिया लालिनो जरी पातला झोक जरी पातला झोक पदरा पदरा पदर सावरीला
Wow. Wow. I think this sets the mood,
Yeah.
Chaitanya. Thank you.
क्या बात.
Anish, should we roll?
Yes, please.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, on behalf of the Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust, it is my privilege to welcome all of you here to this lecture that we've all been looking forward to. Dr. Anish Pradhan, of course, will introduce Adrian McNeil, but it's been our intention for the past several years to create an opportunity where we could invite him actually to deliver this memorial lecture, because he is the appropriate and the most ideal person to do so. The trust was set up, as the name reveals, in the memory of Dr. Ashok Ranade, who, frankly, I mean, I've gone through the list of participants and I don't think he needs any introduction for any of you. But nevertheless, let me say a couple of words for those who will then perhaps catch it later on YouTube or a recording. Well, as it happens, Dr. Ashok Ranade was most known for was his tremendous music scholarship. I mean, he really strode like a colossus in the field of music scholarship, and quite easily was regarded as perhaps one of the foremost ethnomusicologists in the world, respected by anybody and everybody who was anything to do with music. I mean, they invariably turned to him for knowledge, understanding, insights. However, his interests spread even beyond music, though music was his forte. But it went to theater, literature, cinema, mythology, dance. So his scholarship was widespread. It could even be eclectic. And that is what made him so multifaceted and multidimensional that it's a near impossible task, as Anish also will confirm, to introduce a person like that in any succinct form. Okay. The important thing is that we unfortunately lost him in a very untimely way at the very young age of 73, when he had planned another 18 books. Death snatched him away from us. So it's really tragic, because imagine the amount of knowledge that the world would have received. Well, the good thing is that he distributed his knowledge very freely through his students. I mean, he was an idealist in that sense. He never refused any student who approached him to learn music, or anyone who wanted to discuss anything about what his knowledge was. He was free. His doors were open. And therefore, that legacy lives on. I mean, spawned as it has been, across generations. Yeah. So the trust has been set up essentially to further his interests. So the kind of work that he would have done and he would have encouraged, the trust now seeks to do that. And it encourages people to approach it for, whatever we can. The trust is sort of based on certain modest means, which essentially comes from the personal contributions of Dr. Ashok Ranade and Mrs. Ranade. But nevertheless, the aim is clear: to encourage work in the fields that he was interested in. The foremost annual program that we regularly hold is the memorial lecture. This is the 13th one. And if you go back and have a look through the website of the trust, you will discover the range of topics on which speakers have come and given absolutely stellar lectures in his memory. So I would encourage, in fact, you people to perhaps go back and have a look at the topics. And I think recordings also should be available, and otherwise you can write to us and I'm sure we can make that available. The trust is run by 4 trustees. We formed it in 2013. So Dr. Anish Pradhan, which all of you do know and who's about to speak after me, he is the chairperson. Then we have Mr. John D'Souza, who's been with us from the beginning. There's Dr. Chaitanya Kunte, well-known musicologist and scholar in his own right. And there is myself. So we have taken the responsibility of running this trust because we were connected with Dr. Ranade personally as well as his students. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic on to Dr. Anish Pradhan, our chairperson, who will introduce the speaker and take the program forward. Over to you, Anish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anjum. One little but very important fact that I'd like to add to what Anjum has already said, that this trust wouldn't have been running without the generosity of Mrs. Ranade, who is an author in her own right in Gujarati and Hindi, and was connected for long years with the All India Radio. So we all thank her for her generosity. Now
I'd like to just interject, I'm sorry, and add.
Yes.
Last month when I met her, I mean, she unfortunately is old and a bit infirm. So she's being looked after in an sort of home that takes care of elderly people. So when I mentioned to her that November is coming and we will be doing our memorial lecture, so do you want me to convey anything on your behalf? So she said, no, as always, my blessings are with the trust and with the people connected with the trust, and particularly this lecture, because she's aware of Adrian, of course. So she's conveyed her regards, Adrian, and she's conveyed her blessings for this event. Anish.
Wonderful. And now I have the greatest pleasure of formally introducing Dr. Adrian McNeil. Adrian and I have enjoyed friendship and association for several decades now. And I'm really thankful to you, Adrian, for having agreed to deliver the 13th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture. A brief introduction about Adrian. Adrian McNeil is an ethnomusicologist who has held research, teaching, and program director positions in various universities in Australia, India, and Hong Kong. Over his career, he has published on the cultural history, musical theory, political economy, and philosophy of Hindustani music. His book, Inventing the Sarod, is well known. He is also a performing artist trained in Hindustani music on sarod by Ashok Roy, Sachindranath Roy, Irfan Khan, Sanjoy Bandopadhyay, with guidance also from Dr. Ashok Ranade. Even though he is recently retired, Adrian continues as the Dr. C.W.W. Kannangara Visiting Professor, Faculty of Graduate Studies, University of Visual and Performing Arts, Colombo, Sri Lanka, and as a guest artist at the Australian National Academy of Music, Melbourne. Over to you, Adrian. Thanks once again.
Thank you so much, Anish, for the kind introduction, and to Anjum as well. And needless to say, and of course I'll say it anyway, it's really a great honor and pleasure to be invited to give this Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture this year. I thank the Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust for this invitation, and particularly to the committee of the trust. To start with, it's customary in this part of the world, in Australia, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking. So I'd like to start off by paying respects to the past and present elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on which Naarm, which is the Indigenous name for Melbourne, is based. In deciding on a topic for this lecture, I couldn't help, therefore, but feel the weight of Dr. Ranade's intellectual presence. While preparing and writing the lecture, I wish I could have raised some of the issues that we will look at today and benefit from his responses to my questions and assertions. No doubt my attempt to engage with him on this topic, if it was possible, probably would have made me as frustratingly tongue-tied as I found myself during conversations with him over a wide range of issues, which often took the form of him playfully trying to confound me, and which he mostly succeeded with great aplomb. I know that. I remember these conversations taking place in his apartment in Bandra East in Kalanagar. And during that time, I remember being affectionately dubbed and called the wretch by Mrs. Ranade, which gives you an idea of the type of dynamics that we had. So I was very much in awe of Dr. Ranade for all the reasons that Anjum laid out before. But out of all those interactions over a number of years, conversations between us often ranged over incredible categories of topics. But amongst those topics, one really stuck to me, and that was about what happens when music and musical thought is adapted from one context to another. And I remember talking about this with him in regards to, first of all, the adoption of and synthesis of Persian music into North India, but also in terms of popular music, going into classical music and film music and all these sorts of things where music circulates and then takes on another form in a new context. And it's this sort of broad topic that I wish to explore today. Although I'm not sure how much he would endorse all the thoughts that I'll raise today, but I think he would probably not disagree with the fact that this is a significant topic, given that we had talked about it before. But I am very confident that he would have conceptualized and framed the topic in his own inimitable and compelling way, like he used to do when he gave those much anticipated opening addresses during the annual SRA conferences in Mumbai, organized by Pandit Arvind Parikh. I remember the great impact those addresses created and what a mood it set for the rest of the conference. It was awesome. Okay, so it's the circulation of music is the primary issue I want to discuss today. And I want to do that in the context of our times, when we're anticipating or perhaps bracing ourselves for encounters between Hindustani Rag Sangeet and AI and AGI. And also to maybe foreground some of the anxiety and types of challenges and dilemmas we can possibly expect to confront. Of course, the impact of AI on American popular music and other types of what you can say, industrialized music has been around for a while and has had greater attention than perhaps the impact of AI on traditional musics around the world. And there's probably many reasons for this, not least of all, the US being a center of gravity for AI, and also the domination of the global musical imagination by American industries and intellectual property rights. But I don't want to be looking at the impact on those musics today particularly, although there could be many issues in common with our topic, the impact of AI on Rag Sangeet, but we'll keep that as a separate thing. But I think it's fair to say that the future impact of generative AI and Rag Sangeet, which I mean by generative is creating music. The impact of that capacity is still a huge unknown at present. Today, I also don't intend to speculate on specific technological issues or particular outcomes that have or might transpire from the encounter between the technology and the tradition of music. Also, just as a disclaimer, I won't be talking about any particular iOS apps that use AI or claim to use AI, or any AI technology that generates traditional raga songs, of which there are a few. I might play an example just to give you an indication of the sound of it, but not really go into the full analysis of it at this point. But rather, this is what I want to actually do today, is draw attention to the philosophical, ethical, and abstract realms of the topic, and attempt to identify what I feel are important ethical as well as artistic and political concerns. I must say there is no ambition here, or more to the point, capability on my part, to be able to provide convincing answers to these questions of what outcomes may come out of this encounter. Rather, I thought the modest aim today is to be able to try at least to navigate towards an informed starting point how we can discuss this topic and this encounter between technology and music. Now, just a little warning. This lecture is structured a bit like those novels that start off with all different and seemingly unrelated threads that then come together at the end of the story and then start to make sense. So just in case you start wondering where this is all going in the first third, I promise that these threads will converge and entangle towards the end. Now, of course, it's, I've taken quite an ambitious topic, and I think we could not just write a book, but a whole series of books on the topic. So I think it's important to have a really good focus to the discussion. And I picked up an analytical approach called the genealogy of knowledge, conceived by Michel Foucault, to help tie together these what seemingly disparate threads. And in his own words, the point of a genealogical analysis is to show that a given system of thought was the result of contingent turns of history, not the outcome of rationally inevitable trends. So what we can take from this statement at this point in the lecture is that despite the hype and beating of drums about AI and its impact, what we can take is that perhaps this encounter, this collision between the technology and traditional music is not really a rationally inevitable trend or a fait accompli in itself, which is how sometimes it's presented to us in terms of technological discourse. Rather, this is how I want to approach it today. The impact of AI on music is actually can be seen to be the result of several turns of history that have now become entangled. And it's these so-called turns of history and the nature of their entanglement that I particularly wanted to explore a little today. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, let's think of these turns as threads of history. So we have one, which is the circulation of music, which was already introduced. The second thread is the development of technology. The third thread are the industrial practices becoming more widespread and rapacious over time. And the fourth thread is the political power pursuing its own ends. And each of these threads comes with its own ancestry of purpose, its own sense of reality, its own language, its own trajectory through time. And at the same time, when we look at the encounter between AI and music, each of these historical terms are in some way or another contingent upon each other. So I'll deal with them separately to varying extents, and then move on to talk about their entanglement later in the discussion and what that means. So the first thread, and I'm going to skim over things and just picking out parts of that thread, which will then become more prominent in the entanglement scenario that I talk about later on. So the primary thread in this discussion is the recasting of music from its source culture into other contexts, no matter what music it is, and no matter what context. History is replete with examples of musical sounds, material culture and thought being circulated, transplanted, adapted, and or sometimes imposed upon another musical reality. It's not possible to tie this phenomenon down to a simple set of parameters. Instead, we'll briefly consider a handful of examples with contrasting influences and outcomes. And in doing so, we'll start back in time and then proceed to the present. You would have noticed that I'm using this term musical reality, which I'm using it in a very loose way at the moment, but I'll get on to defining it, tying it down, and making it more potent in our discussion as we go along. One of the circulations of music that's happened in the past, which always captured my imagination, was something I also talked to Dr. Ranade about, was the circulation of South Asian musical thought, material culture, and practice into the Indonesian archipelago, beginning around the 3rd century CE. This cultural influence was facilitated through economic, political, social, and Buddhist and Hindu religious imperatives and migration after the collapse of the Maurya Empire, before the Gupta Empire was established. Over numerous subsequent generations, the pre-existing art music practices in Java and elsewhere adopted in various ways and adapted nomenclature, as well as intellectual, philosophical, religious, and aesthetic concepts to give meaning and explanation to existing musical practices, and hence to enhance, develop musicological and aesthetic narratives in that part of the world. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It happened over a number of centuries and in too many ways to go into any detail beyond some generalizations relevant to our larger topic. Musical thought, coming under that rubric, I put aesthetic philosophical formulations such as rasa theory, but also organizational principles that come under the general philosophical framework of Tantra. And we find that these types of ways of thinking, these musical realities, were incorporated into artistic practices in so many different ways, ranging from the gendering of sound between male and female sounds, through the court ritual of Badoya tantric dance, which is from Central Java, which has its aesthetic and philosophical links back to tantric philosophy. It's a fascinating dance form, which I encourage you to follow up on if you haven't come across it before. But apart from just the general philosophical frameworks, we also come across the adoption of terminology through technical terms, say in rhythm, of lagu, guru, luta, which people will be aware of, part of the Sanskritic terminology related to the division of time. There are many other terms too, which we could also point to, but just the point of this is that ideas, general ways of understanding music, ways of understanding the world, traveled into another part of the world that had existing music culture. And then somehow there was this synthesis of these particular sensibilities of the practice with a way of thinking about music. At the same time, tangible things started to be also adopted and adapted, and these things from material culture, such as musical instruments, one in particular, kecapi vina, circulated into the Indonesian archipelago sometime between 400 and 1400 CE, where it became kecapi in Bahasa Indonesia, hasapi, husapi, kucapi in the Batak languages of northern Sumatra. It also found its way to southern Mindanao in the Philippines, where it became kuyapi. Now, the point I want to make just about this particular episode is the circulation of many elements of music occurred because of, not because they just autonomously just took off out of India or out of the subcontinent and just landed in the archipelago, but they took place because of wider political economic imperatives. The circulation of music was embedded in this wider movement and was facilitated by individuals, groups, communities who set out to make sense of how to engage with different musical realities in intellectual and creative ways. So power, influence, the cultural orbit of the subcontinent expanded into Southeast Asia, brought ways of thinking, material culture, and then people on both sides of the equation were left to make sense of what was going on. And in Indonesia, things were synthesized and somehow engaged with in order to create more meaning within an understanding of musicological and aesthetic narratives. So what we have is an integration and fusion of musical practices and philosophical frameworks and sensibilities that took hold at that time, but continued to develop in their own ways over subsequent centuries. So this enduring legacy of this encounter and the circulation of musical thought evolved over generations and took on its own inflections and its own sense of meaning over time in the Indonesian archipelago. So power, trade, migration created the conditions from this musical influence and musical circulation to occur. As I said, I'm just skimming over this. There's much more, as Andrew would well and truly know, with this influence of South Asia and Southeast Asia. I want to switch now quickly to another influence, that of the Persian cultural orbit within North India. And here we're looking at a reverse flow in the sense that the Persian cultural orbit ebbed and flowed into Hindustan via different conduits at various historical junctures. From the time of the Turco-Persian hegemony in the 11th century onwards. Political, economic, and religious imperatives also created the conditions for the circulation of musical thought and musical culture, including nomenclature, aesthetic conventions, and terminology, tuning systems, and instruments. As is well known, the cultural synthesis of musical practice, music culture, aesthetic and intellectual thought that was created over the centuries in that environment was also an embodied lived experience, which was not without its own vicissitudes and tensions. Nevertheless, generations of countless individuals from the Persian cultural orbit and within Hindustan set about to make sense of this coming together of different music realities in so many different ways against a varying backdrop of tension and negotiation. New genres, instruments, performance practices, ragas, and musical realities were created that gave voice to the wider political, cultural, religious, and cultural dynamic that was unfolding. And these things, the instruments, the sound, the performance genres, made this reality of the synthesis audible. So from this, the relevant point for our larger discussion is again the circulation of music and musical thought from one context to another was an embodied experience. It was carried on the back of non-musical imperatives of politics, of trade, of invasion, of whatever, however you want to characterize it. This synthesis, this encounter unfolded not take place in any simplistic linear trajectory either. Rather, it was episodic, contested, and at times advanced through mutual dialogue and collaboration. But overall, it was, from our perspective now, it's still difficult to account for fully. I remember when Catherine Schofield gave her annual lecture, she highlighted the role of the Delhi Palawans in the early 17th century, in the way that they negotiated, the way that they engaged with first of all, the Persian, and then through Persia, the Arabic and Greek musical realities, and the type of intellectual inquisitiveness that was part of that endeavor. And of course, you know, we're well aware of the wonderful musical outcomes and cultural synthesis that grew out of that. Those Renaissance period that was facilitated and engaged in with by the Delhi Kalawans. Okay. So bear with me, we've still got one more example of these threads which still don't seem to be making much sense on their own. The next sort of encounter of the circulation of music, the context of the circulation of music I want to look at is this, of course, is with European colonization in South Asia. When the networks and structures of colonization and modernity disrupted the hereditary social organization, political economy, performance practice, imagination of music in Hindustan in various ways. Of course, this is a huge subject which has been written about extensively. And I'm not going to go into many details, but just to pick out, again, cherry pick out a couple of elements to this thread, which will then be woven back into this entanglement discourse we're going to encounter at the end of this talk. So again, in this case, institutional power and the weight of coloniality intersected with other imperatives and agendas in creating conditions which facilitated the circulation of music. But of relevance to our broader topic is that a cultural and intellectual emphasis was placed on the visual representation of sound during this encounter. What I mean by that was that when Hindustani rags Sangeet migrated from feudal structures to urban spaces, a rift became apparent between orality, which I know Sanjay Bandapati called sometimes called boltation, which is a nice term, and visual notation or swaliti. So this is one of many, many elements that happened at that time. But this is something that's relevant to I think, to the engagement of technology and AI with music. So this is why I picked it out. The flows of sound and time in this musical reality that arrived via colonization in India transformed flows of sound and time into discrete points and notes and beats on paper through the first of all, through notational methodology entering into the musical imagination, and then through the pursuit of individuals and through the activities of newly found music institutions. So the environment at the time created the possibility, this contingent historical turn created for this favoring or the introduction of visual representation of sound. In the process, we know that the spaces between the notes in notation, where Shrutis and Ucharan of the rag, what's emotional flavoring, were left out somehow because they couldn't be accommodated within this visual representation. And similarly, the space between the beats in rhythm, the measuring of time, the flow of time, were transformed into these discrete points where time was marked according to discrete points, and the space between those discrete points somehow could not be accommodated within the written and the visual representation of sound. Now, in this case, power was also involved. Power, economic, and other imperatives were involved in creating the conditions for this encounter and the way that Hindustani Rag Sangeet was influenced, negotiated, and tried to make sense of a different musical reality. So in this sense, the musical reality came into Hindustan, and the musicians and intellectuals tried to make sense of this new form of reality. And of course, this all happened under the unequal flow in which imperial power was wielded, and also in which the musical reality of Europe was being presented as culturally superior and part of the narrative of the civilizing mission. So what took place, and this is slightly different perhaps from the previous two examples, was not so much a dialogue of musical realities, but it was more the unevenness of power. The unevenness of the power differential meant that there was an uneven responses to the musical influence of the Europeans from traditional hereditary spheres and from Western educated urban spheres. So it created a rift in some ways in the musical practice. And that rift, or that division between hereditary spheres and modern institutionalized or Western educated urban spheres, is something that has never been fully resolved or reconciled. Okay, so there's pretty controversial stuff in there, and perhaps some of it may seem a little bit unconnected at this point of time. But the point from those three cases that I want to make is that music and musical thought and material culture circulated due to non-musical circumstances, and with radically different inflections and outcomes. Nevertheless, what each of them share is the fact that the circulation followed in the wake of expansion, exertion of dominant political and economic power. So I'm making that connection between power and music. And it's the way that music makes power audible is something that's always fascinated me. So the musical ideologies and realities were somehow representative of worldviews and realities of the structures of power, and in turn made them audible. But the main point of these three examples is to draw attention to the circulation of music as a lived experience, unfolding over generations and making sense of different ways of thinking about music, using its material culture and coming up with incredibly creative responses. Now, we've considered just three examples in relation to South Asia, but of course there's many examples of this. Similar processes unfolding, especially those framed by slavery with Cuban music, and just the two musical realities, the Spanish and West African coming together, to Brazilian with Portuguese and West African music, to blues, jazz, and even to the chutney music of Trinidad and so on. So this circulation has its, as the musicologists know, has its own historical contingent turns. And this is the point of making this observation is that when we turn to technology and when we turn to other contexts, we realize that this type of process of circulation and the reason for and the ways in which circulation unfolded starts to change radically. And this is what I want to shift over to now, and to look at how music circulates within an industrial context. So, shift this. Just so another contingent historical turn in our genealogy, which we're building up slowly, took place when the musical score, the composition, was recast as a bounded text and acquired ownership and property rights under common law in England in the same manner as a book or some sort of manufactured product. This disruption came about through the technological invention of the gas-powered printing press in England in the early 1800s. The invention of this printing press enabled the mass production of printed musical scores. So this disruption led to the extension of intellectual property rights for music creators, and also to the start of regimes of royalty payments. It also somehow coincided or reinforced past practices of European music. Well, what I mean by that, it also coincided with a time when European music itself was changing for various reasons, through political economy, through performance practice, through social organization, musicians, everything. But before the advent of intellectual property rights, we find that often the case that a musical score in Baroque or Renaissance music is much more open-ended and accommodated and encouraged improvisatory practices by performers. But with the advent of common law, we find that the possibilities for creativity by performers and the input, the creative input of performers into the performance of a piece of music was somehow disrupted, because things within the score acquired a value, an economic value. So we're bringing in another consideration into the circulation of music, in particular of economic value. But also it had an impact on the cultural imagination, where we came up with this binary between composition and improvisation as separate creative pursuits. And this splitting of this creative act before, where there was a continuum between fixed and composed and then improvisatory practices in European musical practice, art music practice, created this new binary, which, as we'll see, has also inflected the way that technology engages with music, and technology has inherited this binary as well. Yeah. We're at this point now where we've sort of gone around in a few circles and made a few observations, but one of the things that I've been talking about a lot is musical reality. So let's just try and tie this down a little bit at this point of time and introduce a new term into this discussion. And when I talk about musical reality, in philosophical terms, we sum up this term ontology. And ontology is basically asked the question, what is reality? And this thing might still seem a bit abstract, but let's apply this term and this idea of musical reality to a fundamental aspect of music, namely sound. And let's go back through this historical turns, through its own ancestral thread about how we think about sound. To do so, I'm going to go back to the 1st century BCE and to the Greek philosopher Lucretius, who wrote a massive treatise called On the Nature of Things, describing the reality of the world from a particular Greek point of view at the time, Greek philosophical point of view. Now, on the subject of sound, and he wrote about many subjects, but on the subject of sound, Lucretius says, let's take sound to start with. Noise is audible because its body penetrates the ears, impinging upon the senses. Voices and sounds are bodily in nature since they strike with impact on the senses. Words and tones, since they can hurt, are beyond any doubt made of material stuff. The ear is struck by different sorts of atoms when a horn is muted, chromium low, or blares away full blast. So, the thing to note is that this wasn't the only take on sound at the time, and over many centuries in Europe, there have been conflicting philosophies on what is sound and relating it to all types of different realities. But this became probably the main line, or the most dominant approach to understanding of musical sound. But it's also the understanding of musical sound that underlines how sound is conceived in technology. That musical sound is external to the body. It's objective, it's physical, it can be made visible and can be physically and digitally manipulated. So this is one ontology of sound, and there's truth in it, absolute truth in it. But if we take another contrasting ontological idea of sound, then we get, this is from Sarangadev in the Sangeet Ratnakara, in the 13th century, where the idea of sound is that, just to interpret this, is that sound starts in the head. You have the desire to produce sound. You pre-hear it. Then that desire to produce sound strikes the fire abiding in the body, the emotions. And that fire strikes the wind, the breath, or the physical elements in the body. And that wind rising along the upward path manifests the sound successfully in the navel, the heart, the throat, the head, and the mouth. So all of a sudden, we've got sound being embedded within the body, within the mind. It's subjective as much as it's objective. So the last action in Sarangadev's ontology of sound, the impact, the physical sound, is the starting point of Lucretius's idea of sound, where sound comes from. So what we've got here is we've got an embodied internal aspect of sound. That, yes, we do hear sound in our ears, but we also hear sound in our heads too. So there's an internal element about sound. So when we're dealing with sound, from these two ontological points of view, one is external, one's internal and external. So one's dualistic in its sense that it's external, i.e. not internal. And the other is a dialectic where they both engage with each other and they're both related intrinsically to each other. So one is more about continuous friction, continuous process that upon a precisely timed impact. And we go back to the idea of notation, where we're looking at the flow of sound being broken up into discrete points of beats and of notes. We can see, again, this ontological discord between these two realities about sound. So, so why bring this up? Because this simple observation gives rise to a series of deep philosophical questions about musical meanings and conventions. And the difference between conventions, understandings of sound, and also other elements of music time, are inherently an ontological one. And what we're doing when we're looking at the circulation of music for one context is we're shifting over from ontological frameworks and musical realities. So every musical tradition has a different ontological take, at least one, on sound, and these can be radically different from each other. And there are other dimensions to musical ontologies other than sound, like I mentioned. These can include the conception and experience of time, the formulation of tuning systems, and the connection of sound to non-musical phenomena, such as the ancestors or to other cosmological elements as well, to parts of the body, to times of the day, to parts of the year, and to different aspects of human behavior. And it's the collision of these different ontologies or realities of sound that becomes highly relevant when digital technology and AI come into the picture. And when we take into account, we start looking at digital technology, which is what we'll do now, comes into account, then this is where the ontological discord really kicks in. Because we know the generation and manipulation of sound in digital formats through recording programs and software apps like Cubase, Logic Pro, and then through these other things which you might have heard about, virtual studio technology, VST, and digital audio workspace, DAW, is predicated on this idea that sound is an objective physical element, which is the musical ontology outlined and described by Lucretius. That in a technological discourse and ontology, sound can be visually represented, like in a type of wave notation, waveforms or whatever. Can be edited, can be manipulated and moved around through particular digital music programs. So technology takes us as basic assumption about music, the Western ontological configuration of sound and time outlined by Lucretius. And it sits with in some opposition to this Sarangadev's notion of sound being embodied as well as a physical force. But sound in digital technology is not just predicated on a Western construct of sound, but relies on other Western constructs about musical reality, such as the emphasis on the linearity of time, as opposed to cyclical time. The technology also highlights the primacy of time being experienced as a sequences of discrete points, beats, as opposed to the experience of continuous flow, as is contained in the concept of time that comes under the term matra, which is the thing that keeps beats apart, the space between beats. Besides that, digital technology, music and music apps foregrounds tonality, harmony, and temper tuning as its default setting. Although you can go into non-tempered tonalities, you have to switch the default settings in order to do that. And then again, it's very messy and somewhat inaccurate. So technology foregrounds that as a default tonality. Whereas modality, which is we're talking about with raga music, maqams, and most of the other music in the world, and the alternate tuning systems that they accommodate, the non-tempered tuning systems, the Pythagorean and other types of tuning systems, and the microtonal universe that is alternate what modality can accommodate. This musical reality, this ontological reality becomes the other, the non-default. So we have this discord, this tension between technological discourse and ontology and diverse musical ontologies. Further, we have the physical attributes, the tangible, the visceral elements of musical instruments are split from their physicality. The sound is taken in virtual studio technology and DAWs and in sampled sounds. And then sold as loops in programs like by companies like Contact, where sounds of Cuban sounds can be sold for enormous profit. That we recorded and then resold, just the sounds, not the instruments. So we're creating this division between sound and the thing that creates the sound. So again, there's another disruption, a split. But when it comes to mimicking the nuance, the style and technique of instruments, say, from South Asia, then we start to get this sort of parody of sound. This sort of, it's almost farcical in some ways, because we're taking the sound, the physical external sound, but not the internal processes, the meaning of sound, the ontology of sound. And we're making a split between those two elements, again, reinforcing this binary of internal, external. And since some serious issues arise out of this, and I wonder at this point, we're running out of, could be over time a little bit. Yeah, I was going to play you some elements of, there's a site called aimusic.so. You can look it up yourself, where there's the essence of Hindustani raga music is being captured in by AI, and some pieces have been composed in which we hear supposedly traditional sounds, but the traditional sounds are, yeah, this is the website you can see here. The
Do you want Chaitanya to play?
Look, we'll just play maybe 30 seconds of the one that says flute. Because yeah.
So, okay, I will play it.
It's the one on the right, if you can, the one with the two very non-flute looking instruments being held by the couple there.
Okay.
I think there's a great correlation between the visual representation and the sonic representation here, where it's absolutely charming to look at, but it's absolutely deracinated in the sense that there's no meaning in it. I mean, it's just nice things put together which we consume, but it doesn't mean anything because, again, we're working on the externalities of just sounds. And the other one, the flute version, is even more bizarre when you hear it. But to my ear, it's tempered. It's in tempered. It's all tempered as well. The tuning. Someone might have a different take on it, but it's it's charming, can be consumed, but it doesn't really tell us about musical meaning or this other ontological depths of the music, even though it's reflects the essence of Hindustani music, as you can see in the description. So we're finding the technology itself has its own limitations and its own ontological framework in which, when you put things like Hindustani music in, it flattens it out and makes it into something else. And oops, not this one, this one. So what happens is that in this case, the sound as a physical external element is stripped of its ontological meaning from its source culture and reinscribed with a new set of meanings derived from technological and industrial imperatives and ontologies. I think this poses a moral and ethical issue on many fronts, which I'll try and touch on just in the concluding statements. But the technological engagement with music is limited by the fundamentals of the reality operating systems created by content designers and programmers. There's a cultural bias embedded in that, in the way that content designers and programmers may conceive of music as well, given the fact that we have this idea from Lucretius, number one, and then trying to then programmers and designers try and then translate that into a technological context as well. So music goes through two filters before it gets to that process that we just heard then. And there's a misconception in this technological world that the elements of musical sound are universal and shared equally across the world. Whatever makes sense and works in one domain, i.e. the dominant domain, can be applied anywhere. But, of course, we know that doesn't really cut it. Hence, in amongst this default setting of tonality for pitch, tempered scales, flattening out of intonation, similarly, we have the same thing, the time being linear, not cyclical, and the understanding that things need to get fitted into this dominant ontological paradigm. The sounds of instruments can be mimicked, and sometimes a farcical and it's almost like a parody in a sense. The samples and loops of sound instruments can be taken in VST, the virtual studio technology, and given particular, give you an idea, given a particular cultural spin. So just I'm taking in Logic Pro, people use this program. I'll try and make it bigger. No, I can't. So we have these loops which music creators use in Logic Pro, where they have Indian chants, Surbaha, Indian Raja, sarod, Afghan Sandrabab, all these descriptions which are othering in such disturbing ways. And the actual samples themselves, the quality of the samples are pretty poor. But like I said, there are other high-end music sample services which have really well-recorded sounds. But again, they're loops, and they're put in, so you take the sound and then you put it into this sort of technological framework of, to put things together. So you're taking sound, which is already sampled and then repackaged in your loop, and then put it into a compiling process that has its own ontological bias and ontological framework and understanding of the basic elements of music. But out of this, and comparing this to the way that music circulated in the earlier times, which was an embodied circulation over centuries, this circulation is happening almost, in very short spaces of time. It's happening amongst, in this case of technology, it's facilitated through coding and through a particular human activity that's not particularly necessarily musical, but whose imperative is much more to do with algorithms and coding rather than to do with exploring musical practices inherent within a particular musical ontology. But from that recording that we heard is that the source content of the music played on instruments like this requires cultural and technical knowledge that cannot be mimicked in any convincing way without taking on board the internal elements of sound, internal elements of music, that desire to create music, the emotional elements that we saw in Ranadev's ontology. But because of the nature of technology, there is no appetite to engage with this level of expertise in the programming of technology, primarily because the cost of doing so would not be compensated by its commodification. And this is where the financial political power comes into play in this type of circulation. So this is the part where we bring it all together. When we glimpse the outline of the genealogy behind the encounter between Rag Sangeet and AI, we have identified and considered three different ancestral threads in this genealogy: a creative cultural discourse, industrial discourse, a technological discourse. And I added a fourth one too, of power, discourse of power. In other words, each one of these discourses or these threads understands and engages with music differently according to the tools, according to the ontologies in which they are founded and which frame and shape those discourses. Now, these different histories and turns of history intersect and are contingent upon each other when it comes to AI and music. As a consequence, these different discursive threads get entangled when we talk about music and AI. And to me, this is precisely why it's hard to get a handle on what's happening. Which means that when we seem to be talking about music, we're also invoking an underlying discursive framework that is industrial, both through language more aligned with technology. And so on that website, which we heard that wonderful music, we have, these are the applications of AI. Then if we bought those loops and we bought the technology, then we can make money through applying it to film soundtracks, to advertising music, to game background music, which is one of the imperatives of commodifying the AI generated music. And one of the imperatives of the technology is enabling this new casting of music into different contexts. Now, out of those three discourses, the creative musical cultural discourse, the industrial discourse, and technological discourse, we can detect a hierarchy within that list. And that hierarchy is determined by the proximity of that discourse to power. That hierarchy alternates between industrial concerns, because that's what pays for and what's to own the sound, and technological concerns, the manufacturing process that creates the sounds. But meanwhile, in the concerns and thoughts about the sustainability of musical practice, of the livelihood of musicians, of the sublimeness of the musical experience and performance, comes at the bottom of that hierarchy. Because of its proximity to power, it's further away from proximity to power. Now, I'm just looking at the time. So in all of the instances that we looked at, I'm going to bring it to a close now. The catalyst for something being split from its source, the thing that enables music and sound, material culture to split from its source culture, boils down to issues of power. And in the process of splitting something from its ontological source and then reinscribing it with meaning from another ontological context, creates an ongoing discord, which a great musicologist, Georgina Bourne, has written extensively about. One danger I see is that the industrial and technological ontologies will challenge and diminish the viability of the wonder and magnificence of the creative and intellectual human achievement of the creation of amazing diversity of musical realities across the planet. In other words, the homogenized ontology of technology and industrial discourse will clear fell this diversity of ontological forests that exists around the planet, and the amazing amount of musical diversity that's in thought and practice that comes from that. The other danger from this collision is that the capability for music to be renewed, to be supported, to be fertilized, the wetlands of musical thought will be somehow affected, damaged, or dried up through the roof, through the way that technology and industrial practices engage with music. There's no thought about what the long-term sustainability of music in that type of imperative. So we've arrived at quite a bleak place. And so if we're looking at how this genealogy of knowledge, this collision, this entanglement of discourses can affect Hindustani Rag Sangeet, I have some optimistic thoughts. First of all is that AI has two elements too. One is the generative, creating music. And I don't think it's going to have a major impact on Hindustani music for the foreseeable future anyway, because of the cost involved of programming in, of somehow making AI aware of the musical ontologies and all the nuances and complexities and contradictions that come from a musical ontology that conceives of an internal as well as external sound. In terms of the generative, today's computational tools are highly capable of handling various aspects of signal processing and feature recognition, enabling them to convert sounds into notes, rhythms, and phrasal structures. They can enforce rules around harmony, instrumentation, or rhythm for music composition, and even tackle complex challenges in performance and audio synthesis. However, they seldom address underlying meanings and musical narratives that define music as an art form. And this is too expensive at the moment to do, and won't have the economic value or willingness to engage in this at present. So, but I do believe that there is a role for AI in Rag Sangeet in pedagogical ways, and in terms of AI technology being able to collate information in ways, information about ragas, information about traditional thinking in ways which would take us ages, as individuals to accomplish. I think there's ways of cataloging bandishes and recordings that to do manually, like people do in archives, might punch in information manually into databases. I think AI can help organize music in a way that has a pedagogical outcome. And having been involved with a project about tabla and AI, I know that it is possible, but it's time consuming. It would take tens of thousands of hours to do under present conditions. But who knows what will happen in the next step of our genealogy with this entangled ontological threads when the braver new world of artificial generative intelligence and quantum computers start to kick in. It's quite possible that this new generation of technology and the capitalist system that finances it will exasperate the ontological discord that has been unleashed since music has encountered the industrial practices of capitalism and digital technology. I came across an article the other day that lamented perhaps we've been tricked into thinking there are no alternatives, and that the economic systems we inhabit are natural, and arguing with them makes about as much sense as arguing with the wind. What Foucault in the beginning called the outcome of rationally inevitable trends. But I think also a meme that I came across actually summarizes this much more pithily and says, the underlying purpose of AI is to allow wealth to access skill. So it's to allow wealth to access skill, or removing from the skilled the ability to access wealth. And I think this is, again, points to the fact that in that hierarchy of things, the sustainability of music and musical thought ontology is the lowest priority in this encounter between technology and music. Now, the last thing I'll say, the optimist in me wants to believe that perhaps a renewed appreciation of the artistic vision sustained through musical traditions may arise in reaction to the deracination of music generated by AI, to the taking away of meaning out of music by AI. I don't know, but at least we should enter into this inflection, this time of inflection in our human history with our eyes open and an awareness of the genealogy of contingent historical turns that have brought us to this place in the first place, in order to be able to know how to navigate into the future. And with that optimistic thought, I'll bring this lecture to a close. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian. I just have a glass of water.
Yeah. Cheers.
So Adrian, thanks. Hang. Yeah.
There's an echo going on.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now it's better.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for that fantastic lecture and for throwing up so many thought-provoking issues. I'm going to be the devil's advocate here and ask you a few questions. One thing is that, of course, we know that we have had a long history of migration, both physical and in different formats too. And they have given rise to various problems of loss of identity, the creation of new identities, feeling of loss of wealth, treasure, heritage, history, tradition. How do you look at these, and what do you think are the ways in which people are trying to regain these losses? The reason I'm asking you this question is that, of course, you did speak about musical reality in the context of sound and music, but what about the creator of the music? Where do you place him or her in your sense of musical reality? That was one question. And the second question is that you did mention that you mentioned Sharandev and the idea of having an intent to make music before even beginning the music. But do you think there is a monolithic idea of making music even in a particular time in history? we already know that we've had more than 100-year-long history of recorded music. Musicians, I mean, musicians from hereditary musician and courtesan families took to this recording technology. So, in a sense, were they going against what Sharandev had prescribed or had written about, or were they already, was it a professional kind of sense of, loss of livelihood that made them go in to accept this new technology? And did that then enhance their own musicality in more ways than one, whether it was the tailoring of presentation, etc., etc.? We can go on and on. Do you see a link between that and what's happening with AI, and whether whether they can make use of AI? Trained musicians. It is happening. I mean, I know for a fact that Stefan, for instance, who is here with us, he uses a lot of computer technology and in his composition, and perhaps he could weigh in with regard to that. But yes, those were the questions I was wanting to ask you. Is there a monolithic idea of sound and music? Does that continue across generations? And is it something that we need to hold on to? And the second is, what about this loss of identity, etc.? And can anybody be called a custodian of music, of particularly traditional music, in this context?
They're fantastic questions and great observations, Anish. And in the beginning, I said, look, I've got no idea, and I'm not going to provide any answers, but hopefully we can start having an informed discussion about where these things to go. So in that spirit, I'll try and respond and say, the only monolithic ontology or musical reality that I'm coming across now is one embedded in technology, the cultural assumptions of technology, and that the diversity of musical realities that exists within traditions, within ways of understanding the music amongst art music right down to indigenous cultures. There is multiple realities, and that Sharangadev's reality is one reality in India. Just as in the same case, Lucretius is one reality in the Europe in Greek thought. And I'm conscious that in order to be able to talk about the concern for this monolithic approach to sound and technology and music that's embedded in technology, then it makes it difficult, because we're trying to highlight the diversity. Doing that, it's an uphill task, because the diversity is great, and how do we account for it? And when you've got something just quite homogenous, and you're trying to say, well, this homogeneity isn't the only thing in the world. So yes, to answer the first question, I think the ontologies came post facto, after the practice, that from these diverse practices, people noticed there was particular trends and particular ways in which music was organized, and then gave voice to ontologies. So that way. So I think the ontologies follow the practice. There is no, and that practice is diverse, is contested, and in ways which makes music robust and makes music more fortified and deeper because of it. And I think that we need that. And I'm very conscious I reduced things down to, in a very reductionist way, in those examples. But the point was, again, just to challenge the fact that there are diverse ways of thinking about music. So that's the first response. Is that to the question, right? The second thing about loss of identity and being able to, for musicians to create things, yes, I think these are really important issues, and I'd love to see how things play out, and especially how musicians and traditional musicians, not just musicians who are well versed in Western popular music and coding and music technology, can add diversity to that technological ontology. I think having used and those composing tools for myself, my voicing today is an unreasonable one of frustration in trying to change default settings and things like that. So the fact that you're engaged in having to change default settings on music programs like Logic Pro or other music generation programs makes it, it does bring in, it really does highlight identity as the identity of, first of all, the cultural assumptions of the creator and the cultural experience of the creator, and also about the cultural assumptions of the machinery and the technology you're engaging with. So it foregrounds identity in other ways, you know. But having said that, you know, if you're going to use that technology, it's like, yeah, arguing over the wind, because it's hard to I'm not sure how one goes about negotiating identity in this. I know that there's incredibly creative people who are going to come up with amazing stuff with AI. I don't doubt that at all. But I have this trouble where the ontology of sound not being physical creates a tension in how we engage with technology, where that sound is taken as a physical object to be manipulated. I think the things that the sublime elements of music, until technology can somehow maybe teach itself through AGI, I don't know. I don't know what the future can hold and quantum things. This is the element that's going to be left out in the creation process. Sure, we can make good sounds and manipulate the sounds, but the deeper meanings of those sounds. Also, I think the interiority of that experience, the linking of sound to those experiences of the unified, like in Sufi music, where the summer gathering, where the sound then becomes something that unifies a community of musicians in intangible ways. These things, I think, give meaning, deeper meaning to music. And I'm not sure how even musicians can use this in ways which make that creation possible. But I do see a pushback where music, the experience of music, of listening to music, will be contested, and people, and I think recently in Kolkata, where I noticed that, you know, there's a pushback towards more chamber experience of music as well, to enhance that unified feel, to enhance the affect of music, rather than just the consumption of music or the entertainment, you know, value of music, but to engage with that deep human experience of music. So that's, I don't know if that answers questions. If there's anything else, yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. I have lots of other questions, but I'll invite questions from the audience. Please go ahead. Chaitanya, do you have some there?
Yeah, we have a question from Gauri Dange.
Yes.
She writes, Dr. Ranade often admonished his music students, Soppa karo noko gao. Don't flatten the nuance and make it easy to sing for yourself and oversimple to receive for your listener. If AI in its early phase does that, as do some singers, there might be a growing audience and music makers perhaps who are happy to make and receive AI music. We see it in writing and publishing already. So I think this is not a question, but a
Statement.
remark.
I do remember one incident where a well-known singer turned up at Dr. Ranade's apartment to see if they could become a student of his, and he asked, the singer said, yes, I sing with harmony. He says, well, I can't teach you. You know, so just, and which was like, it was confronting, and the person was highly upset and left the place in tears. I know, but it underlies this this that Roy was making, that yeah, I think this thing about temperament is a huge thing, and when you compare the tempered tuning, say with Drupad, where the opposite of tempered, where there's hitting the absolute center of the note is the imperative, and that's where the effect comes from. I think there is a tension. I think this tension, I don't know, maybe it's one between, if we think of music as being consumption, it can be consumed, it can be for entertainment, or it can be used, it can also have other deeper effects on the listener as well. So it depends, I guess, if you're just into, if consumption is the main, and entertainment is the main driving force behind the music, or your engagement with the music, then I think tempered things doesn't make it, it's fine. But if you're looking for more deeper and more sublime experiences, then I think the tempered singing, or the flattening out of things, is not going to be very satisfying.
Yeah, can we have the next question, please?
One has written the question here in the dialog box, that if anyone wish to ask the question directly, we can.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Adrian, thanks. Nice to hear from you and see you actually after a long time, even though we live only about 50 kilometers away. I really like this distinction that you're making about who's making the music, in a sense, really, right? And I guess the distinction I want to draw here is between music that is see, there's two parts of technology. One is where you're using technology, but there's still the creator is still the human. There is still, you're deciding which loops go where, and so there's still that agency, the human agency, which is part of that. But then the thing with AI is, and as you heard in that piece that was played earlier, there is no human element to it, in the sense that we don't know what is creating that music. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but we just don't know what's creating that music, and hence we don't understand whether there is an ontological basis at all for that music, right? Whereas the use of, whether you use sort of software, there's still a human element to it. So I think, that's an interesting dynamic. But also, I think what scares me a lot about this is that is that the difference between this and recorded stuff in the past is that, this AI is trained on stuff that's already out there, and the people who made that music have no say in how that is going to be used. So, you can use AI to train it on everything on YouTube, and you imagine how much is on YouTube. You could get AI to be very, very quickly to the point where it can produce something that is indistinguishable from that which a human can produce. And this, of course, is the Turing test, right? Whether you would know what was given to you was human generated or not. But anyway, I'm rambling on here. The point I'm trying to make is, I think that there's a scary element to this. And hence, as a community, and of course, I don't pretend to be part of the musical community and part of the student community, I think should really think about how the community approaches this, and whether there's a role for legislation, whether there's a role for, how the music should be used, because at the moment, it's a free-for-all. The big tech companies can take whatever they like, and they can use it for whatever purpose they see fit.
Yep. Thank you, Venkat, for those thoughts. I agree with everything you said, especially about the paying for the creators and just farming things and just taking things and knowing that corporations can take things and take data sets and build up libraries of things, and knowing that they can do it because they can, and nothing's going to stop them at the moment. But to go back to the original point that you made about creators, I think the thing is that, yeah, creators, the creative mind, imagination is great, but it's the tools that you're using. So if you've only got a hammer, then you want to, and you're used to, someone gives you a hammer and then everything's funny as a screw, then it creates that sort of same ontological discord. And similarly, if it's in the kitchen, if you're a chef and you want to make a subsi curry, then there are no spices in your cupboard. There's only maybe some salt and stuff. Then you're going to come up with an approximation. You again, your imagination is only as good as the power of the tools or the diversity of the tools and how they're constructed and how they're conceived and for what purpose as well. So again, that creativity the internal thing strikes an external ontology, of machinery. But in terms of trawling things, I think with the Hindustani music, what we've discovered through this project I was involved in was that it was about tabla, trying to come up with a pedagogical tool where you could practice and tabla actually accompany you in real time and play just like a human being, like that. But it required someone recording to start with in 50 different ways in different contexts, following from one stroke to another, and all the bowls on tabla to do that, and building up a data set, which would take months, and then turning that data set onto YouTube in order then to listen to and then you'd have to program to say, well, look, this is what's happening here, and the amount of guidance it would take in order to frame and to direct this machine learning is, at the moment, it's too great. Whereas if you've got the ontology already there about, in say American popular music, this is a chordal progression, this is a particular type of sonic environment, then it can much easily pick it up because all the ducks line up, the ontology, the tools itself, and the programming and the data sets. And it's an industrial environment anyway. So they all they're more compatible in that sense. But when you're looking at traditional music, then and musics which have a much longer heritage and much more complex, then things don't line up as easily. So that's why I think it's, even if people want to create data sets and machine learning that replicates or mimics Hindustani rag sangeet, then I think we're a long, long way away from that. I don't know. I'd love to. That's my personal opinion, but I'd love to hear other people's ideas if they're feeling the same way. If it's possible or not possible. If they had their own experiences with using AI and rag sangeet.
Well, in my own experience, I've never really used it, so I can't really offer. But I'm just thinking in terms of our history. I mean, the way that instruments were built, for instance. I mean, you spoke about the harmonium. The harmonium, as it sounded maybe 100 years ago, is very different from how the harmonium sounds today, and the way it is tuned today, particularly in certain parts of the country. And so when we just talk about it being a tempered scale, then that is not entirely so at the present moment. And it's become a part of our musical reality. And our sonic reality. And there are practitioners of eminence who are now, at any rate, used to that sound. Okay, and they're making music with that. So, and that's just one instrument. I mean, if you looked at sarod, and you've researched that so wonderfully, the way sarod sounded 100 years ago, or sitar sounded. I mean, you couldn't get long means on sitar, and there's recorded evidence for that. So, but those are all steps in a long trajectory, and so as a performer and a student of music, I feel this is yet another step, and who knows what the future holds for us. And so I don't really feel threatened. I feel threatened definitely to the extent that if my music or the music of everyone else was to be used in a manner that I didn't want it to be, then I would certainly feel threatened, and yes, then I would need to take a stand about it. But if I wanted to use, technology to move in another direction, in another dimension, then I wouldn't stop myself, or I wouldn't stop myself from collaborating someone who had the tools to use the technology to take me into a different dimension. I think, Stefan, what do you think? Would you agree with me? You're doing it on a daily basis.
Well, I would certainly agree with you, but I haven't used AI, to be honest.
No, I know that, but I'm saying computer technology because Venkat also mentioned software, and that's a very important distinction that he makes there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, using software has become, normal for so many musicians today, and just part of the practice. And I think some of the problems that may arise from that are actually similar in the context of European traditional or European classical music and Indian music, like the role of the presence of the physical presence of musicians, the social aspect, and all of that. I think that it's not something that is, it's within the Western or European music itself. There are similar, kind of conflicts or questions arising. It's not something, between necessarily. Western and Indian music.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, thank you for that wonderful question and response, Stefan. I think at the heart of this is who's mediating. So when you're talking about the harmonium, it's the creators, the artists who are, and they've got their, put them into concerts, so they think about it and they mediate it. So it's done, that mediation is happening there. Of course, the sitar and sarod, they went through these amazing, transformations over time. And again, we ask the question, who mediated, who instigated that? And in more recent times, we just like in the last 50 years or so, 60 years, when you look at the guitar, the use of the guitar. I mean, I know that the Hawaiian guitar was there in the 1930s, but the use of guitar in Bridgebushan, Kabra, and things onwards, where you look at the evolution and how people are doing, changing the design, adding different tonal qualities to it in order to normalize it within an ensemble, to make that instrument, like the sitar and sarod, word a voice for this musical practice. For what was people hearing in their head, they were trying to find a mechanism, of an instrument that would give voice to what was in their head. But when we go into technology, then we ask the question, who's mediating this? Then we find that, then I don't know, it's less likely it's the artist in some ways, because you've got to deal with the machinery, it's the algorithms. It's something that, I'm a lot of when it comes to programming and things like that. I'm not sure, but maybe there are musicians who now can get into programming and into to mediating it. But at the moment, no, the mediation is through technology and through industrial practices and through
giants. Yes.
That's the difference.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Adrian. I think I'll hand it over to Chaitanya now for the vote of thanks.
Thank
Yeah, Adrian, it was a fantastic lecture, and I remember Dr. Ranade has written an article about it. It talks about music of tomorrow. This was written in 1997, and he actually hints about how there will be non-human intervention in making of music in the future. So, so on behalf of Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust, I extend a hearty vote of thanks to Dr. Adrian McNeil for gracing the 13th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture and delivering such enlightening lecture on this online platform. His talk, while setting out a new perspective on cultural musicology, has opened up many issues and questions, especially about music making in both traditional and modern or postmodern sense. This insightful presentation was indeed an apt tribute to Dr. Ashok Ranade, because in Adrian's talk, we can see the reflections of Dr. Ranade's thoughts about the constant interaction of music culture and the music makers and the utility of music. I thank Dr. Anish Pradhan and Anjum Rajabli for curating this lecture, and Mr. John for providing the technical support and making this lecture possible in this online. I also thank all viewers and enthusiasts who participated in this event and making it lively. And lastly, I hope we will all meet again for next year for the 14th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Anjum. Thank you, Anish.
Yes, said that was truly enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a very, very intensive preparation seems to have gone into it. So it was very cogent.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good.
Yes.
I'm glad someone could make sense of it, because I couldn't.
Dr. Ranade would have